Welcome, and thank you for attending the Right Stuff Over Time, a Digital Preservation 2020 panel presentation on collaborating with stakeholders for the selection of materials for digital preservation. I'm Nathan Tallman from Penn State University. We look forward to sharing our work with you and to a lively discussion in Slack. Here's our next slide, please. Here's our agenda for this panel. We will begin with a few housekeeping matters before diving into our subject. First, I will present on work that Lauren and I previously published to establish a framework for appraisal and selection for digital preservation, including suggestions for new criteria and how this foundation is used to build scaffolding to facilitate appraisal at Penn State. Next, Lauren will discuss how she implemented this framework at the University of Virginia using a university archives case study. Then, Mike will share about how he has implemented appraisal and digital preservation workflows at Indiana University. Courtney, who presented at an earlier session today, will have her slides read by Lauren. Courtney observes on the real-world impact that appraisal and selection choices have on communities and the historical record. We will close out with questions and answers in the Slack channel for this session. Next slide, please. While the recording for this session plays, panelists will be available in the Slack channel for this session. Please feel free to interact with panelists and other attendees during the session, but please hold questions for the panelists until the final 10 minutes of the session. As a reminder, the session adheres to the DLF Code of Conduct, which can be viewed at bit.ly/33 uppercase T, lowercase u, uppercase V, 9, lowercase g. Next slide, please. Building capacity for decision-making at Penn State. Good stewardship requires good collections management. Collections are like pets that need caring, feeding, and the occasional trip to the vet. The menagerie is limited by the availability of resources and capacity of the organization. There is only so much time, space, and money, and if the collection is to remain useful to a designated community, it requires active management, selection, weeding, preservation, and more. Deciding to preserve is a collection management function, a curatorial decision. Digital preservationists are partners and collaborators in collections management, but we are not usually the subject specialist who has the domain knowledge to appraise the material. However, we do hold technical expertise that can help inform these decisions. Our colleagues, whether called selectors, curators, collection managers, or something else, are best suited to make these decisions. It is our role as the preservationists to help inform and facilitate these decisions. We can provide frameworks and criteria, as well as implement programmatic evaluative systems. We are the veterinarians who can make recommendations for the health, longevity, and vitality of the creatures in our menagerie, but it is the pet owner who makes the decisions about them. Next slide, please. A framework for appraisal. This framework was put forth by myself and Lauren Work at DigiPres 2018. It is based in decades of collection development theory, collection management practice, and archival appraisal theory. The framework establishes 6 criteria to be considered. Specific implementations for selection decisions, such as quantitative or qualitative scoring, are left up to the needs and the culture of the collecting organization. Organizations can apply whatever scoring or evaluative system that works for them. If using a numerical score, consider weighting criteria that should have a higher priority. Value focuses on research value per the organization's collection development goals. It is likely the most important criterion. Uniqueness often favors foreign digital, but can also incorporate the availability of an analog preservation alternative. If the original analog is in fine condition, it's probably not the preservation copier instance. It probably is still the preservation copier instance. Cost incorporates cost to acquire, cost to preserve, and labor investments already made, including digitization. Legal or fiduciary responsibility incorporates the need to preserve organizational records and archives, as well as the legal rights to preserve other materials. Restrictions, or the ability to provide access, should be viewed as a negative criteria, particularly if there is no legal or fiduciary obligation. Preservability of content and context reflects the degree of effort required to preserve the content and limits therein based on the material. This favors open and standard digital formats. Possible new criteria to consider adding to the framework include representation, or how does this material inhibit or advance the representation of peoples in the historical context, and agency, or the degree to which the creator or subject in the content had in deciding the fate of the content itself. For more information about these criteria and examples for both general and special collections, please see our guidelines and criteria to select for digital preservation at goo.gl/lowercase q, uppercase g, uppercase w, lowercase I, uppercase m, uppercase a. Next slide, please. Scaffolding to scale capacity at Penn State. The first two bullets in this slide are formal guidance documents, while the third is a process. The digital content overview defines content categories, streams, and types, provide a framework for analyzing collections and objects. Content categories describe how material is created, acquired, and/or managed. Examples include vended collections, library managed collections, and library created digital content. Content streams are sources of material flowing into the digital preservation program. Examples include born analog digital collections, born digital special collections, and theses and dissertations. Content types are broad, high-level genre describing physical or technical characteristics of the material. The digital content types and format guidance provides technical advice by content types in the digital content overview. They include technical documentation on the composition of significant properties, recommendations, and acceptable formats for each content type. Content types may also have subtypes. For example, the content type moving image and sound has subtypes of motion pictures, moving image or digital video, and sound. A digital content review is a close and collaborative inquiry into a defined content stream to identify content categories and content types. This process helps to develop a shared understanding of the materials and their needs for the long-term preservation and access of those materials. This scaffolding, along with the framework as a foundation, should be able to accommodate appraisal, preservation planning, and other preservation activities for any content entering the digital preservation program. These documents and process build on the work of Helen Hawks-Yu and Don Bauer at Notre Dame University, the Library of Congress recommended format statements, and the National Archives and Records Administration's Digital Preservation Framework, as well as Nance McGovern's, who's at MIT, Digital Preservation Management Tools. Next slide, please. Facilitating preservation. The foundation and scaffolding, along with consultation, should provide curators the necessary perspective to make an informed appraisal decision by selecting a level of digital preservation commitment. Our levels of digital preservation commitment are inspired and informed by the NDSA levels of digital preservation. Levels of digital preservation commitment define a gradient of classes, each increasing with the amount of preservation management and activity performed on the class. It is not feasible to treat all of the digital materials the same at our scale. For long-term sustainability, curators must appraise digital content and select levels of digital preservation commitment that describe the effort to which preservation will be attempted. These choices will define the preservation actions taken on the content. Following established archival control theory, these decisions do not need to be made on an individual basis, but can be made at any level of the collection and content hierarchy as makes sense for the material. And while selections made higher in the hierarchy should cascade down, curators should be able to select different levels of digital preservation commitment lower in the hierarchy as exceptions, based on the needs of the material. For example, the Judith Jones papers as a collection might be a level 1 digital preservation commitment, but Jones's research data in that collection may be at a level 3. Next slide, please. This process is akin to the more product, less process, or MPLP style archival processing, wherein the content, context, and relevance to users dictate the amount of arrangement and description performed within and across collections. Curation is also iterative. Value to your designated community can change over time. Curators should revisit selections of levels of digital preservation commitment over time as necessary. Access and usage of collections may be an indicator when appraisal and selection should iterate. Thank you. Lauren?
Thanks so much, Nathan. You see a little bit of your own menagerie there as well. I'm Lauren Work. I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at the University of Virginia, and I'm going to spend my time today doing a little bit more of a granular examination around implementation of the guidelines and criteria to select for the digital preservation framework that Nathan outlined so well. This is an effort on my part to show how implementation, with some success, some failure, and maybe most importantly, some reframing to try again, might echo within your own work, as well as speak to some of the strategies and reframing we can take on around more equitable selection and preservation practice as a whole. To do this, I'm going to focus on a single use case. While I recognize that this narrows the scope of some of the implementation of generalized practice for the framework, I found it useful and necessary within my collaborative preservation practice at my institution as it functions now to establish new ideas and to start to build a preservation program out of projects. This approach has helped me do things like gain buy-in and understanding from stakeholders. It's provided a way to build frameworks and workflows for processes that aim to integrate components of the framework into collaborative library-wide practice. And it's helped enable decision-making that centers collection management and curatorial decisions as important partners with preservation. It's also a case that may be familiar to many at this conference, no matter if you're at a large or small institution, and the case is this. Our university archives was asked to take on a large transfer of born digital photographs from the university communications department when they decommissioned a server. And I'll pause for groans here. Okay, let's place this case quickly up against the framework in terms of value, emphasis on that research value. This collection is of high caliber and is very relevant to the collection goals and mission for university archives. These are images of the modern history of the university from 2008 to 2019 and cover important events like student life, sports, university settings, staff, faculty, etc. It's also highly unique as it's born digital. Only one of the images distributed via publications, but really most are a high number of outtakes and never published materials. Additionally, the photographer created descriptive metadata in addition to his embedded image metadata that we were able to obtain on transfer. Cost. This is an interesting element to consider, and I'd love to hear from people in Slack afterward in the Q&A about approaching this element. For this case, I argued that there was both a political cost calculation. If we didn't move quickly and save these materials, there might be a political cost to their potential loss, as well as arguments around the actual cost of the storage of all of the materials. And there were over 13 terabytes of born and digital images that needed to be considered for preservation storage calculations. Restrictions. As these were university works for hire, the university owns the materials and can make them accessible. And that's really great for access and preservation considerations, but we might also want to put a pin in this to think about that agency element that Nathan outlined previously. And finally, preservability of content and context. We were lucky to get early notification of server decommission and were able to work with the university photographer to transfer materials as well as his metadata export. The files are well known and ubiquitous, if some proprietary formats, and we were able to also preserve the original directory structures, which is also significant. So I should pause here to note that the application of the framework was applied as possible to the ongoing selection and appraisal after transfer of the materials. And this is where I had a little bit of a failure pertaining to convincing colleagues under an admittedly very short time frame due to that server decommission around the cost point for the server and preservation maintenance in particular. While I felt that we didn't necessarily need to take all of the digital files and could instead take those raw, uncompressed files potentially, but maybe not every derived TIFF and JPEG from those same files, or could ask the photographer to do some self-selection with assistance prior to transfer. Ultimately, the collection was too big and time too short to enact a selection process pre-transfer. And this again is likely very familiar to folks here. While born digital collections are often seen as more difficult to process and make accessible, they at the same time can have an easier invisible default to just take it all, which also lends to huge backlogs, which can then add to existing issues around representation in collections, processing priority, access and use, which then may drive other processing decisions, etc. Not to mention those large costs for preservation storage of materials that have not been appraised or processed. Another roadblock around this time included our university archivist departing and our great new university archivist joining us, so we restarted this review again. And for this iteration, enough time had passed for me to integrate some of the components of the framework into a digital collections team at UVA that forms a cross-departmental decision-making body around digital collections. So in this team, curators and selectors make decisions around unprocessed, underprocessed, or reparative work for larger digital collections via this body in a nomination process. And it presented an opportunity for me to link preservation storage decisions, which is a more beginner level approach on my way to implementing something like Nathan's content streams, to the curatorial process. And so the selector role in this case has also evolved at this point, thanks to improvements in library workflows. And our new university archivist was able to build on this prior work and do things like ask questions related to her curatorial process for the collection. For me, playing a role in this curatorial decision-making as a preservationist included things like leveraging transfer logs and file format identification to answer her questions related to existing framework criteria like preservability, where there's still a discussion to be had around our strategy for preservation of raw and compressed files versus something like TIFF, as well as value and uniqueness. And my role also helps with new points like representation, such as how we could use things like directory prints that are part of packaging and transfer protocols to take something like a first fuzzy pass at identifying underrepresented groups in the collections via directory or image names to move toward appraisal and processing decisions for the collection based on what she felt were the most important curatorial decisions. So for me, the work continues to integrate and familiarize collection managers and curators with preservation criteria that can guide decision-making. And to make a note of the potential agency point to consider in future, this may include things like ensuring we consider, as part of our collection process, what takedowns or notifications may look like to grant agency to those in our collections, even if those collections may have technically passed the bar for university ownership and copyright. I also want to use our existing work to move toward better practice now in partnership with my archivist colleagues. And this includes things like taking steps around leveraging digital preservation or technical appraisal materials that are machine actionable, but could aid with quicker processing or potential identification at scale of things like underrepresented groups in born digital collections. Virginia publishes our accession records, so what might it look like to drive discovery, access, or prioritization if we utilize some form of these materials to allow people to request more of what we have in Born Digital, therefore setting a mark for researcher-driven prioritization needs? I'll end there to transition to Mike and how he's implemented his workflows, but I wanted to leave you with this transition slide from a recent presentation on advocacy-driven collection development from Tamara Evangelistia Doherty, who is the AUL at Cornell for Rare and Distinctive Collections. And it underscores the collaborative endeavor we're in as preservationists and stewards who need to continue to adapt our practice. Curators and selectors are adapting their approach to collection development and selection policies too, and we can continue our preservation collaborative endeavors in support. And Tamar posted components of her presentation on Twitter, but from this slide, I ask us to think about her observation of what do our curatorial narratives say about us as agents of memory? What collections do we need to build on and revitalize in order to elevate histories of color? And how might we, in my own words, as digital preservationists, better support these goals in our practice as well? Thanks, and I'll pass it to Mike.
Thanks, Lauren. My name is Mike Shallcross, and I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at the Indiana University Libraries. Today, I'd like to talk about our work refining digital preservation workflows to better support the archival appraisal of content on legacy storage media. In her presentation at OCLC's 2013 Pass Forward Symposium, Erin O'Meara asserted that no one cooks the bacon alone, that a successful digital preservation program requires collaboration among a variety of individuals with different skills and strengths. In our attempt to empower staff to more actively appraise born digital archives, we have sought to balance the deep subject knowledge and appraisal acumen of archivists with the technical skills and troubleshooting abilities of our preservation staff. Next slide, please. Archivists at IU have been acquiring born digital archives on legacy media for many years, but it wasn't until 2016 that we implemented our first born digital ingest procedures and began depositing disk images to a local repository. The initial goal of this work was to migrate content from potentially fragile media to a secure environment so that it could be dealt with more fully at a later time. From 2016 to 2018, 620 media items, individual floppy and optical disks, were deposited to our repository, but the process was largely without appraisal. The primary reasons for rejecting items were blank media or read errors during data migration. Next slide, please. While we succeeded in moving our content to a more stable environment, we were ultimately kicking the appraisal can down the road and thereby creating more work for ourselves in the future. This accept everything approach resulted in the preservation of duplicate copies of material, as well as content that was essentially unknown or outside the scope of our collecting priorities. We also had poor intellectual control over content. While labels were transcribed, this information was only recorded in text files that were stored alongside the disk images. Meanwhile, inventory spreadsheets were only updated with a free text notes field that, depending upon the staff member, might include the number of files, common file format extensions, and/or a list of file names for content on the media. There's also the distinct possibility that sensitive information such as credit card or social security numbers were being stored unknowingly. All of this increased our costs of stewardship. While the storage costs for individual floppies were not overwhelming, they would accumulate over time. More significant, however, were the time and staff resources that would be required to make sense of the materials at a later time. Next slide, please. The lack of appraisal for our content is understandable in that the appraisal challenges associated with legacy media are multifaceted and by no means unique to Indiana University. Media labels, if present, may be inaccurate or misleading. If the content needs to be reviewed, care must be taken to avoid degrading its authenticity and integrity. Even then, legacy formats may not be renderable by commonly available applications. Sensitive information such as credit card or social security numbers may present risks highlighted by institutional data management guidelines. And finally, the sheer amount of legacy storage media acquired by archives and the relative ephemerality of such carriers require appraisal strategies that are both efficient and scalable. Next slide, please. Starting in 2018, we took a number of steps to develop more efficient digital preservation workflows and at the same time facilitate the appraisal of content on legacy media. An important first step was to redefine roles and responsibilities. Archivists would focus on content and context, while preservationists would manage the hardware and software required to ingest media items and provide overall technical support. We also established appraisal guidelines for digital archives, very similar to those outlined by my fellow presenters. In deploying these, we sought to be flexible and, at a minimum, ensure we had a basic understanding of content and that anything deposited to our preservation repository reflected our collecting priorities. Finally, to reduce opportunities for user error and ensure that we were collecting and recording a standardized set of information for each media item, we developed a Python tool to automate disk imaging and content analysis. Next slide, please. This slide presents a high-level overview of our ingest and appraisal workflows. It begins with the archivist, who prepares a shipment of digital media by applying barcodes and recording basic descriptive and contextual metadata in a spreadsheet. The shipment is then transferred to our Born Digital Preservation Lab, where a preservationist performs ingest procedures on each media item. This includes the creation of a disk image, as well as a logical copy of the files, file format identification, and a scan for potentially sensitive information. Results are written back to the shipment spreadsheet, and a more detailed report is prepared for each item as well. At this point, the archivist reviews the collected information and, if necessary, the extracted files. The archivist may also update descriptive metadata and/or add notes about the content before documenting an appraisal decision in the spreadsheet. The preservationist provides technical support throughout the review process and then creates archival information packages and deposits these in our local repository as directed by the appraisal decisions in the spreadsheet. Next slide, please. I next want to take a closer look at some of the strategies we've used to empower our archivists in their appraisal decisions. Information in for each media item is presented in the shipment spreadsheet alongside previously collected descriptive metadata. This high-level view of the entire shipment includes basic information for each item, such as the number of files, duplicate files, and files in unidentified formats, the size of extracted content, the most prevalent file formats, a range of last modified dates, and indications if potentially sensitive data has been identified. The spreadsheet also includes a link to a detailed HTML report for each item, as well as a direct link to a folder that contains the content and a photograph of the media carrier so that the archivist can better interpret the artifact itself. If it's necessary to review files, We have licenses for Quick View Plus, a universal file viewer, so that archivists can more easily review content as needed. To ensure we are meeting our goal of more product with less process, this appraisal is focused on content that is unknown or which presents potential issues, such as the presence of social security numbers. Next slide, please. One of the most important lessons we've learned is that appraisal, even at a high level, is time consuming, and that it has created some bottlenecks in our throughput. After we hired a digital archivist last year, we were able to make significant progress on our backlog, but we found that it is essential to have such responsibilities assigned to specific individuals. We also continue to explore how we can better surface and present information to our archivists. Second, the impact of appraisal on the rate of deposit to our preservation repository was fairly modest. In 2019, we ingested 646 items, and of those, 52, or about 8%, were deaccessioned. At the same time, the review and appraisal process has increased our confidence that we actually know what we're preserving and are in a better position to retrieve content when it is needed. Finally, in an effort to better characterize and describe content on legacy storage media, we've begun to explore some other strategies with different Python libraries: named entity recognition, or NER, with Spacey, topic modeling with GenSim, and facial recognition with Python face recognition. While initial tests show some promise, there are significant questions we need to address before implementing any such procedures. Beyond the sometimes messy or inaccurate results produced by the tools, the potential for algorithmic bias could seriously skew our understanding of materials. Moving forward, we are excited to incorporate lessons from these successes and cautions so our archivists and preservationists may collaborate more effectively in the service of our donors and users. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. The following observations on appraisal and selection for digital preservation are based on Courtney Mumma's experience having built and supported an open source software community and software platform, Archivematica, working in web archiving programs in the US and abroad, the Internet Archive, and supporting a consortial digital preservation service, which includes storage infrastructure options at the Texas Digital Library Consortium. She's a trained archivist and librarian and has worked with hundreds of individuals and digital preservation programs in a variety of institutions. Her comments were invited to this presentation after she reviewed and commented on Lauren and Nathan's framework document. This is a picture of Courtney during a typical day working from home during the pandemic, having moved from the living room floor after seating the chair to the cat. Digitized collections are the first to be selected for preservation processing and placed into distributed storage. They are often in formats which are the least resistant to standard preservation processes because they've been digitized by skilled preservationists in libraries and archives. The cost of digitization, as we all know, is no small part of our budgets. So when decisions are made about what gets digitized, they are typically high-profile prestige collections. When high-profile prestige collections are born digital, they are also more likely to be processed for digital preservation purposes. Born digital processing is an even more complex commitment for many institutions lacking resources, expertise, support from leadership, or any combination of these, each also impacted by the fact that good digital preservation practice is a moving target, complicated by disagreement and competition among practitioners. The high-profile prestige collections are typically records of predominantly white institutions and individuals that serve to reinforce the libraries and/or archives' standing because it is reliant on the same predominantly white, wealthy institutions and individuals. What Courtney has observed, despite valiant efforts of some individual programs and individuals to work against this trend, is that the resources and prestige gained from prioritizing high-profile collections, such as these, is the strongest factor in determining not only what is accessioned into collections, but what gets processed for access and preservation at the highest level. Policy changes at the top of our leadership need to recognize and counteract these circumstances. We need to collectively assert that content set aside for digital preservation processing and storage must be representative and equitable, and direct funds away from prestige collections into doing so. This means a major shift in current practice, radically interrupting capital-driven appraisal decisions and reaching into our backlogs to prioritize processing of records pertaining to minoritized groups, as well as directing funds to community-based projects that would allow for their processing and top-tier preservation. An essential part of this shift in practice is to interrogate and disrupt practices of competitive collection purchasing and acquisition, as it works directly against efforts towards equitable preservation of cultural heritage and collective memory. We need our colleagues in academia to help by dedicating research to quantify these observations. First, we have to define the elements that would indicate successful, equitable digital preservation performance. Then, to find out changes need to be made, we need a census, or in Nathan's word, a macro digital content review of the content being placed into replicated digital preservation storage so that we can work with leading granting bodies, service providers, and institutions to redirect funds to equitable selection for preservation efforts. Ultimately, one thing seems clear. Equitable preservation means not only adding the two criteria of representation and agency suggested in Lauren and Nathan's framework, but elevating their relevance weighed against cost and fiduciary considerations. I wanted to have a call here as a reminder that this work has been in action by others in our field for some time, including Michelle Caswell's action items for identifying and dismantling white supremacy in archives, which can be found at bit.ly/3DTR uppercase C, lowercase c, O.
Appraisal, act now to take advantage of our 2-for-1 offer. Separate shipment and handling required. Seriously though, here are some suggestions for steps you can take at your own organizations.
Take the time to define your selection criteria and how they'll be evaluated.
Define equitable digital preservation and assess our work using a macro digital content review.
Digital preservation cannot be done in isolation. Collaborate with stakeholders on all life cycle stages, but particularly appraisal and selection. Don't let progress get bogged down in the details. Don't throw the spaghetti on the wall and see if it sticks. Iterate as needed to improve and reflect changes in local curation practice. Remember, any appraisal is better than no appraisal. Let's dive into those Slack questions.